Hi, everyone. As everyone is filtering through, let me just introduce you to what's about to happen. So welcome to BFI Network at LFF and this very first event in a series of case studies that are going to be exploring some of the incredible debut feature films that are showing in the LFF program and shine a spotlight on the filmmakers behind them. My name is Anna Bogutskaya. I'm a writer and broadcaster and absolute horror fiend. So I'm very, very pleased to have the chance to talk to Natalie Erika James, the co-writer and director of Relic, which is screening in the cold strand of LFF this year. I've got some questions. I've got a ton of questions for Natalie, but I'll make sure to leave some time for you to ask questions at the end. And the lovely Cara from BFI Network will also be monitoring the chat box. So if you think of any questions while we're chatting, pop them in the Q&A box, not the chat box, and I will make sure to get to as many of them as I possibly can afterwards. But hi, Natalie. It's really lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. So we've got about an hour and I've got about 3 pages of questions for you about Relic. So
Okay.
I wanted to start off with, I like starting off any interview with kind of asking what came first in a project. And I read that you first started writing Relic in 2014. So what was it first? Was it an image? Was it a character? Was it a story or a scene?
Yeah, I actually found a notebook in preparing for press for Relic that I was writing in when I started writing the film, and it looks like the first image was the idea of the house being bigger on the inside than the outside, and kind of this space of hoarded things that was kind of going deeper and deeper into the house. So that was probably the first image, and I think directly related to my grandmother's house, which obviously that was a big inspiration for the film because she had Alzheimer's, and there were a lot of hoarded things in that house. So to me, it felt like she was maybe holding on to those things. And I read that as her trying to like hold on to her memories in a way. So yeah, I think that was the very first image.
And I wanted to, before we move on to the house, which is such a big element of the film, I wanted to go focus a little bit more on the path to getting Relic made.
Yeah.
So you've already been making quite a few successful short films and music videos before jumping into your first feature, notably Creswick from 2016, 2017. So can you talk a little bit about how you started, how you started moving Relic around, and how did you use the success of Creswick in particular to get the ball rolling?
Yeah, in some ways it was kind of reverse engineered. My co-writer and I already had a script for Relic, like a first draft, and we decided to make a proof of concept that had a different story, in fact, just basically told the same, talked about the same themes, had the same setting and tone, but was a much more succinct story that we could do in 10 minutes. So it was a pretty calculated move. Like, we'd seen a lot of other people had success with making a proof of concept. And I have to say it was really useful, not only in getting representation for one thing, but also just being able to, demonstrate to potential producing partners or investors that, this is the type of film we're going to make. This is the tone. And yeah, I found it really helpful. So that was kind of the path. We already had Australian producers on board, but making the short opened us up to more international partners. So yeah, useful in a lot of ways, I would say.
Oh, it's very smart move. And kind of, can you talk a little bit about your experience on pitching Relic, especially since you mentioned that you wanted to work with international partners?
Yeah, so I signed with a US agency, WME, and they were great with, they set you up a whole bunch of meetings, and some of them are more successful than others. Pitching a feature isn't as regimented as pitching a TV series, for example. Those can be quite, structured. Whereas I feel like pitching a film is much like this. You're just having a conversation with someone, and hopefully they've seen the short film as well. So there's a starting point to for which to have the conversation. And then it's really just about speaking to like why the film matters to you. I think that's the key thing, you know, that people want to know. It's like, why the story, why you, why now? And if you can demonstrate the passion for your project, which I feel like, you know, most people would have anyway. And part of it is like selling yourself as well. I would say that, you know, they're really looking at you as a person and how you can connect to them and how much you can articulate your ideas. Important for a director. And that is, you know, that's the main thing in the meeting. It's not so much the plot points or the beats.
And did you is it a particular type of expectations or approach to pitching a horror film as well, especially a horror film like Relic, which is so atmosphere heavy and eerie, but not so much about, you know, the jump scares or kind of what some people might think of.
Right. Yeah, I guess, I mean, there's nothing particular about it in terms of like preparation or, you know, bringing props or anything like that, I would say. But again, that's why a short film really helps, because that demonstrates what they can expect. And then I think, you know, most horror films or most films in general, you want to speak to the emotion, like the characters and why it's going to emotionally resonate with an audience. So yeah, I wouldn't say it's, personally from my experience, it wasn't all too different from you know, trying to pitch anything else.
And I want to talk a little bit about some of the inspirations for Relic. And you talked a lot about kind of your love for Asian horror, and I wanted to hear from you kind of what elements in particular kind of you drew from for Relic.
Yeah, I suppose one of them is the treatment of, or the considerate, or the way that you convey the menace in the film, and the fact that it's deeply psychological. So often in Asian horror, the ghost or the, you know, the creature, the menace, is usually a woman who's been wronged in some way, and that ultimately a lot of films end with feeling a lot of compassion for that person, or, you know, that ghost. And that was something that I certainly tried to carry over with Relic, with Edna's character, you know, at the end, that you, the sense that you feel and you empathize with her. So that's one thing. Often as well, I feel like there's a, you know, not always the case, but there's also like a restraint that I really appreciate. And there's a sense of like building tension within frame and holding on shots to do that. So it's not as reliant on jump scares, although they of course have their place. So that was another element. Also the physicality of an actor and that uncanniness kind of bringing about terror. That was another thing that, you know, I really love about Asian horror. So you can probably see that a little bit in Relic as well.
For sure. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about that sort of shifting of perspectives that exists within the film, both between the characters and almost somewhat also between genres, between kind of the psychological menace and the supernatural horror as well, or tinges of supernatural. So what was important for you in achieving the balance between those tones?
Yeah, the shift in perspective. I guess for me, you know, I think the horror genre was, for me, the appropriate way to tell a story about Alzheimer's, because it's kind of the perfect medium to talk about fear and externalize those fears on screen. You know, you can get really deep into the characters, kind of the darker part of their psyche. And maybe for me, I've just always, I growing up was a really like fearful child, so it's like a way of working through those things within myself, potentially. Who knows? But yeah, I mean, just as important is the emotional component and the kind of very real life horror, which I think has to be tied to emotion when you're talking about, you know, the end of someone's life, or the heartbreak of watching someone lose themselves and, you know, decay. So they're so, for me, they're like, you can't have one without the other in the story. They're so intrinsically linked. So, and a lot of the horror moments are kind of rooted in the emotional kind of relationships that the characters have with each other, and how those are shifting as well. So, you know, maybe in a more traditional film, you would have the scares every 10 minutes or whatever it is. But I think for Relic, it was tricky. It's difficult to do because I think you feel like the story hasn't earned those scares. So just trying to tie it as closely as possible to what scares you or what's scary in real life.
It feels like a good moment actually to bring in the characters of Relic, the three generations of women in the same family. So did you always envision it being a story about three women?
To begin with, the first draft had, I think Kay had a husband character and Sam had a brother. But over time, we found that those relationships or those characters felt a little bit like extraneous to what was really interesting and you know, what relationships were really singing. I think also part of it came about naturally because it was my mother's mother who had Alzheimer's. So there was already that, you know, tri-generational setup. And I think there's something really nice about the simplicity and unity of like seeing your future reflected in your mother, and by extension, your, you know, your grandmother as well. So I also was really I guess one of the visual influences was a series of paintings called like the Three Ages of Death and Woman. So you could almost read it as like a representation of that as well.
And I wanted to ask you now kind of about working with your actors, because you've got three incredible performances by your lead actresses. So kind of, could you talk a little bit about working with them, or about your process of working with them, both individually and collectively, especially with such an emotionally dense story?
Yeah, I feel really lucky because I have to say that was one of my biggest fears going into it as a first-time director. You know, I don't think there's anything worse than losing an actor on set, you know, or a sense that they don't trust you or something like that. So they were really generous with me, which, yeah, I'm hugely grateful for. But I think a lot of the process, I mean, each actor is different. So I feel like a lot of it is kind of having really frank discussions about what, you know, how they like to work as well. But a lot of our preparation was in having a lot of discussion, not just about the characters, but also kind of not dissimilar to co-writing. You know, you kind of just talk about your lives, and Bella calls it like trauma bonding, where you kind of just bear it all. And I think, you know, because they have to go to such depths to, you know, deliver those performances. Like they really have to drudge up a lot. I mean, not every actor works like that, but these guys certainly were drawing on their own personal connection to loss and, you know, the shifting dynamics of a family and the heartbreak of that. So I think being really honest with them was really key, and just never shying away from I guess an honesty about that experience. And you start to build the language about how to talk about the, you know, emotions essentially, and experiences that you can take to set as well. So you have a reference point of like, oh, this is what we talked about, you know, months ago. So we didn't really have that much rehearsal time. I don't tend to do too much rehearsal. We certainly worked in the room, just, you know, so everyone gets comfortable with each other. And we also had a lot of stunt rehearsals, which is great, kind of icebreaker as well, because part of it, there's a lot of laughing, you're just running around, it's kind of ridiculous. So it's great. And everyone was so game, and they really got along, like all three of them, really, like almost instantly. So we had a few dinners, that kind of thing. And that was kind of the prep. I think from memory, Emily's plane was delayed by like 3 days. So
Oh, wow.
we only had 3 days with her. before the shoot. So yeah, again, a lot of it was in having a lot of phone calls beforehand. And she also had to, of course, do the Australian accent, which is a very hard one to master. And she had a lot of voice coaching sessions, and I think she nailed it, honestly. Like, I don't know if, our audience can tell if they're from the UK, but it's, it's pretty amazing. And luckily she was the type of actor who, some actors really see it as a burden to have the accent, but she saw it as a way to kind of get into the character. So she nailed it.
I mean, I'm terrible with accents, but I think that you nailed it. I found there's something really interesting that you mentioned that I want to pick up on, and it's kind of these methods of getting and especially maintaining trust with your performers. Especially I think with a film like Relic, which does require a lot of them physically, just in terms of the stunts and the physicality of the performances, but also a lot of emotional depth in the subject matter and how they're dealing with this heightened situations, but also incredibly real and human ones. So can you talk a little bit about how you manage the relationship, especially kind of knowing when to push them and when to stop and kind of decompress, or some of the methods that you found helpful in maintaining a good set environment, but also in getting the depth of the performance that you need?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is, the biggest part of the job in some ways is to create an environment in which they can comfortably fail, essentially. And so that means that they're willing to take higher leaps, because then, it doesn't matter if the success of the leap doesn't matter. So I think that takes a combination of just a personal relationship, as well as doing a lot of preparation for the scene to just really know it back to front and have, things or ideas up your sleeve that might, get them there, or I don't know, reinvigorate a moment, or, I think it's just in being really excited about all the ideas within the scene, and feeding off of what they think about it as well. It's not, I think the worst thing is to think that you have to be some terrible dictator and be kind of alone in your tower and like shouting down at your actors. I think that's what a terrible way to work. And you don't have to have all the answers as well. I think that's one of the big things about maybe first time directors struggle with this idea that, I have to step up and I need to know everything. But that's why you have collaborators, and actors are certainly collaborators as well. And it's just as valid to turn around and say, well, what do you think about this? And, you can accept it, or you don't have to. But those are some of the approaches, I would say.
I know I'd like to dig in a little bit into Edna's character, because you mentioned that kind of Relic is partially inspired by your own personal history with your grandmother. But one of the things I found really tender about the film is that you never really make her into a monstrous figure, even though she's menacing and creepy, and it's also all tinged with a lot of love and also a bit of sadness. So can you talk a little bit about how you crafted and what was important for you in crafting Edna, especially as there is a long tradition in horror of making any aging women on screen kind of the monstrous figure.
Demonizing the elderly. Yeah, I mean, I guess part of it just comes from maybe because of that personal connection. The point of the film isn't to demonize people with Alzheimer's. It's to really have compassion for them and to try and see it from their experience. And a few ways, I suppose, like part of it is of course casting, and finding an actor that has equal parts charm and the ability to terrify people. And Robin is certainly like just the funniest sharpest, 76-year-old I've ever met. And yeah, a lot of it is kind of endearing Edna's character to the audience before things start to shift. And in
Mm,
a way, it mirrors Sam's experience or Kay's experience, this idea of someone you love and someone who's so familiar becoming really unfamiliar. And a
mhm,
lot of that is the terror that, the real life terror that the film is trying to capture. I think also perspective as well. There's definitely moments where we're seeing things from Edna's perspective. She's discovering her bruise. There's her in the bathtub as well, and you really
mhm,
sense her fear as well. It's not just a totally inscrutable kind of figure in the film. It's you can tell she's lost too. So I think you can't help but feel for someone going through that as well. I think also part of it is the sense that in the writing, there's a sense that Kay and Sam are being like drawn into Edna's experience,
mhm,
and into like talking about shifting perspectives, the way the house starts to shift as well.
mhm.
You can make the leap that maybe that's Edna's lived experience, and that's really something to be sympathetic towards.
Mm. It's I want to move on into the house. So thank you for bringing that up again. And it's just dripping in atmosphere, and it's so eerie and creaky. So I wanted, and it kind of feels almost subversive of again the very familiar notion of kind of a haunted, creepy house where things just seem a little bit off. So I wanted to kind of dig into your process of designing this house for the screen. Were there any films or books that particularly you drew from?
Yeah, I guess we were trying to find something that felt initially to be, although you felt like the sadness of things falling into decline, like a sense that it was
Mhm,
neglected, that
mhm,
it still felt kind of benign and kind of sweet, like
mhm,
in terms of the color palettes, and kind of light and airy, and in
mhm,
that poltergeist kind of brightness kind of way. So it wasn't like a certainly not like a gothic mansion, or dark
mhm,
wallpaper or anything like that. And again, that was trying to tap into the idea of a familiarity, or a really deep sense of history that
mhm,
you start to turn on its head. So the banality of objects that's suddenly become sinister. Those were the types of things we had in mind when designing it.
mhm,
In terms of one of the other things we really wanted to imbue into the space was a sense of, yeah, I guess the inscrutable, like a sense that there were spaces that were out of sight or that you couldn't quite see through to, or the use of frosted glass or something obscuring the frame. So that
mhm,
was a combination of production design and cinematography. And then for the labyrinth space, we wanted to avoid it feeling like going through a wardrobe into Narnia, that it was like this immediate break from reality. We wanted that to feel really gradual, I
mhm,
guess, like a lot of the slow burn nature of the film itself, that, by the time you're kind of lulled into this sense of like, is this normal? Is this okay?
mhm,
Oh no, that's not okay. You're kind of already stuck and it's too late. So, yeah, we used a lot of the same architectural language as the rest of the house, so that it still felt like it was very much a cohesive whole, even
mhm.
if everything was out of whack.
And I wanted to pick up on the details that you mentioned, because there is so many little props or details that become
Mm-hmm.
scary. In kind of especially in the kind of the calmer scenes where it is that house does seem familiar and welcoming and warm, like your grandmother's house.
Mm-hmm.
But can you talk about the candle making,
Oh
the
yeah.
notebooks, the kind of the props that even the spaces that are kind of piled up with stuff. Can you talk about the importance of props that are very everyday and how to use them to make them horrifying?
Yeah. Um, the candles in particular are pretty significant. They were inspired by actually my cinematographer Charlie. His father had a dementia at the end of his life, and he had been a jazz musician, I believe. He played the saxophone, and a brilliant musician who, as his condition worsened, would continue to play, and his music would start to get out of key, although he couldn't quite pick up on those changes until much, much later in his life. So I guess it was taking that idea and putting, kind of laying them over these physical objects that Edna was making, and that it could almost convey her deterioration or over time. And in Creswick, the short film, which is the proof of concept for the feature, we use that idea similarly with the father character who makes these chairs that are kind of slowly becoming more warped over time. So I guess for the candles in Relic, it was just externalizing that deterioration through her craft.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about the soundscape of the film as well. So what was the most important thing for you in designing the sound of the film?
Yeah, I suppose part of it was in giving the house a real presence that was beyond the visuals as well. So I feel like in a way the house feels almost alive, and there's a lot of sounds that kind of relate to the human body and kind of organic growth and decay. So like heartbeats that are slowed down, which give it a sense of like breathing. And I guess I just wanted to pull from the diegetic world as well of the film and heighten those as a lot of psychological horror films do. So
And can you talk kind of a little bit about the practicalities of your collaboration with your sound designer and composer when you were actually making the film and capturing these thuds and the creaks and the groans of the house and adding in the more bodily sounds as well that you mentioned?
I had a composer, Brian Reitzel, who worked really closely with Rob McKenzie, our sound designer, although they one was in LA, one was in Sydney. So prior to, I think we started working on it before we shot, but we started trying to find key sounds, for example, like Edna's breathing, that the breathing of the house as well. And they went off, both of them went off and like recorded a whole bunch of stuff. Rob would be cooped up in his double-story studio and just like record himself, making weird noises in the dead of night, and really like creeped himself out at one point doing that. Brian would go off and create instruments, and he's almost like a little mad scientist, just kind of cooking up noises, and then they would share a library of sounds. And so the score and the design was kind of pulled from the same kind of, I guess, language of noises. So it was something that we agreed on ahead of time, and then when we combined everything, it seemed to kind of fit together quite well. So.
And I really want to get into the ending, which I think is so interesting. So I'm assuming that everyone who's tuning in to this has seen Relic. But if you haven't seen it and you don't want any conversation that's spoilerific or that talks about the ending, now is your moment to tune out. But let's dig into the end and the practical effects of the end in particular. So I don't know if you've given the creature, the puppet, a name, but
we call her the Other. That's the
the
name.
other. Oh, and it's her. Okay. So what was the design process for you to get to the final stage of the Other?
I suppose because I'd made this short and it had a similar puppet kind of other at the end of it, that we already had a bit of a starting point, but we really drew from I mean, part of it was, of course, the black mold that, you know, makes its
Yeah.
way, is kind of a motif throughout the film.
Mm-hmm.
And so we needed something that was I guess, the eventuation of that, and that decay that was happening. But we drew from real life and what people kind of look like towards the end of their life. And what was most important was the fragility and physical, like, vulnerability
Mm.
of the other, and that it wasn't, and of course taken to like the supernatural extreme.
Mm.
But yeah, I think that was the key thing. So we looked at a lot of, we still wanted it to look elderly, so the
Mm-hmm.
skin was, you know, there were more wrinkles, but we looked at a lot of like mummies, for example, that kind of texture, but then
Mm-hmm.
bringing some black mold to it as well. So yeah, it was about like 7 to maybe 8 or 9 stages
Oh wow.
that Edna's transformation
Mm.
had. So the first stage might just be like a small bruise, and then, you know, there was like a chest plate as well with the
Mm.
skin that could come off. We also had a wonderful stunt double who did all of Edna's kind of more rigorous you know, moves along the floor as well. So
Mhm.
she had to have these like silicone SFX pants that she, you know, would slip on, and it would
Mhm.
just be torn skin everywhere. There's of course the knee breaking moment where they had this kind of joint that was able to, you know, swing out the bone essentially.
Mhm.
So I would say it was about 70% practical and 30% visual effects to
Mm.
do a lot of cleanup, that kind of thing. I mean, the animatronic was, yeah, next level. I mean, I'm so in love with doing that kind of stuff. And I had 2 guys next to me at the
Mhm.
monitor with kind of almost like car remote controls that could control all the muscles in the face. And
Oh
I
wow.
thought we would need visual effects for the eyes. I just
Mm.
assumed, but
Mm.
turns out your expression comes from the muscles in your face. So we didn't use any visual effects on the face at all. It was all just like cleaning up the rods and yeah, the wires or whatever. So yeah, it was pretty. I was so impressed, and trust me, like the stakes were so high on that element, you know, because I knew it was like, even if,
Mm.
you know, Emily's performance was great, whatever, the lighting's great, if the other didn't hold up, it was
Yeah.
gonna be yeah, a shit show. So so thank God.
I mean,
Yeah.
it worked out beautifully, and I want to stick with it for a bit because did you? It's such a tender, unexpected ending. Especially when you know you feel like they're about to leave the house, they're done, they
Mm,
can manage to escape, but they choose Kate chooses to go back and have this really unnerving but really tender moment with the other, with what's left of what Edna has
mm.
become. Did you get any, you mentioned that the stakes were really high with this moment. Did you at any point kind of have any pushback about the ending or questioning, or was the ending kind of something that you really wanted to stick with?
Yeah, I think I definitely remember having meetings where
Mm.
there was pushback, and you know, it's certainly not a traditional horror ending, so you know, some concerns being raised. But in
Mm.
the end, I think we found partners who were willing to, yeah, or just really understood what the film was about. Because I think the endings of horror films are one of the like hardest things to do. I feel it's always the mythology and the ending that's like the
Yeah.
hardest to nail. But they also, you know, um, speak to what the film is about. So
Mm.
for me, that emotional ending was always key, and
Mm.
what, you know, the film is trying to say. So if I think back to the first draft of the film, a
Mm.
lot of superficial things have changed, but it always ended with like a family coming together
Mm.
on a bed at the end. So again, it's supposed to be highlighting, I guess, the importance of connection,
Mm.
you know, in the face of all these horrifying things.
And could you talk a little bit about how do you direct an actor? How did you direct Emily with working with the animatronic? And
Yeah, right.
yeah, and almost as well, kind of
Well,
how do you direct the two guys that were next to you with the the
yeah,
puppet
yeah.
masters?
Yeah, I guess in some ways, Emily would say something like, I mean, she's such a pro, and
Mm.
she said to me once, like, "Oh, usually you just get like a tennis ball to act against, so this is amazing." You know what I mean? So, so I think the puppet itself was really beautiful, and it was
Mm,
moving like in a really
mm,
nuanced way. So in some ways, it's not dissimilar to
mm,
acting against a person. But we approached the scene, we always talked about it not on horror terms, more about like
mhm,
the characters, emotional truth. So we kind of considered it as not dissimilar to a funeral rite,
mhm,
a very intimate act of, and very visceral act of helping someone die almost.
mm,
And that was just how we framed it. And yeah, I think in her performance, you can feel like this resonant, reverence rather. I'm sorry, it's like 9:30 p.m. My brain's going cloudy. um Reverence
mhm,
for the other. And yeah, that was certainly in the craftsmanship, and
mm.
her just talent as an actor as well.
And before we move on to the Q&A bit, and just a reminder for anyone watching, pop any questions into the Q&A box. I'll get to them right away. I just wanted to ask another thing kind of about the mythology, which you mentioned. The ending and the mythology are the hardest things to get to nail in making a horror film. And what I loved was that there's no direct verbalizing or explaining of what exactly is going on. There's shreds of family history, there's the black mold, there's the
Mhm.
shifting house, which is very House of Leaves as well, and kind of you're not quite know what the labyrinth is or where you are in it. So could you talk about your choice of leaving things kind of ambiguous?
Yeah, I'm a fan of ambiguity in general. I think, not to confuse an audience, but just
Mm,
so that there's room for interpretation. And I think sometimes when you are forced to, particularly in something like horror, which is
mm,
very specific, and when you break it down into, if you spell it out as like supernatural mold, it just starts
mm,
to feel a bit naff and kind of erodes the maybe the poetry of
mhm,
some of it. Yeah, I prefer. I think as long as, for me, it's most important that it makes like emotional sense and
mhm,
lyrical sense, perhaps. And obviously, there needs to be an internal logic, but it doesn't
mhm,
need to be completely spelled out.
mhm.
At least those are the films that I prefer. And so, yeah, that was kind of the approach I took.
That's lovely. And we've got a few questions in here from the crowd, so I'm just going to read them out to you.
Mhm.
Adam asks, can you please talk about the look of the film and the wonderful feel of it? How did you work with the HODs in pre-production? References? Did you storyboard?
Mhm. Yeah, I we definitely pulled a lot of images as references, like just
Mm,
from other films as well. We did storyboard, but mostly just the stunt sequences and the prosthetics sequences, I would say.
mhm.
I also draw really crummy storyboard notes for myself as well, which I don't really share with people. But I also use like shot designer
Uh-huh.
as well, um, just to map it out. So more like mud maps, I would say.
Mhm,
I
mhm,
tend to work with, and they're always just like a blueprint, and you might throw them out on the day, but it's just like a
mhm,
starting point to work from. In terms of the look of the film, yeah, I suppose maybe something like Antichrist was a big reference in terms of like the coldness of the
mhm,
forest, and this idea of the coldness of the house, and it permeating the wholes as well as the characters as well. And I guess we wanted to create a sense that it was in the grade that it felt almost like a muted, like faded photograph, like faded memory, something like that. So yeah, I mean, in terms of process, like lots of discussions, lots of exchanging of images. I tend to, because I write and direct, I tend to start pulling them from the get-go, like while writing as well, which is always really useful when you start having those discussions with HODs. What else? Ooh. Yeah, I suppose it's just collecting references and doing a lot of research, you know. Yeah.
And Robin asks, how did you cast Relic? Given Robin, Emily, and Bella are fairly well known, did you want a particularly recognizable cast?
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily what you know, as a director, you kind of go, I need an actor of a certain clout or anything like that. But definitely there are realities to casting, and some, you know, if you get partners on board who require a certain actor of a certain profile for your budget level, then that becomes a consideration. But I think it's mostly about like the amazing work they've done as well, more than, you know, how famous they are, you know. So yeah.
And Sunny asks, how many drafts of the script were written until the final version came together? And did you?
Oh, mate, I could not tell you. Oh, sorry, what was the end of the question?
No, it's a two-part question, but let's stick with the draft one for first.
Oh, it's so hard to say. I feel like I did, I don't know, maybe like 30, but officially like funded drafts, I think we had about 4 rounds. Yeah.
Okay.
So like the UK, we've got government funding bodies. Yeah.
And the second part of Sunny's question is, did you storyboard the film before the sound designer, music composer got involved?
Oh, no, I think I already had those HODs locked in, and the storyboards were done in pre-production. Yeah.
And could you, Olivia asks about, could you talk a little bit about how you gain funding for Creswick? It seems like an integral step in getting Relic made.
Yeah, unfortunately, Creswick was completely off my own back. Again, that's I guess the upside to film school, and I guess working in advertising a bit as well. The ability to pull favors from your friends and, of course, pay them back through working on their sets as well. But yeah, that was just all, saved up money and some very lovely people who helped me out.
Very fair. And I'd like to add a question of my own onto that one. I know it's kind of at what point in making features and working in directing ads and directing music videos did you feel ready to make the jump into directing a feature?
I think you have to just go along with the opportunities that arise. I don't think there's ever a point where you go, okay, now I'm ready to direct the feature potentially. You know, you kind of, you know that, like, I'm sure a lot of you, like, it's a goal that you're working towards. So of course you can always make more shorts. But I think a lot of the time the way that it develops happens quite organically, in terms of like when a partner or producer will come on, and then or like a fund will come up that you want to apply for. So I don't think there's ever a point where you kind of go, I am 100% ready for this. But that's the excitement of it. That's like the fun of it. I will say I did do what we call a director's attachment. Maybe there's something similar in the UK, where I got to follow Lee Winnell around on Upgrade for 3 months, which was great because you're not doing anything, you're just observing, and it does prepare you mentally for like the the realities of more like what you have to problem solve and the expectations placed on a director. So that was certainly helpful.
And there's there's a really interesting question from the crowd here, but I want to actually tap into that of kind of what are some of the important learnings that you've gained from crafting a sustainable, because I think the word successful gets thrown around a lot and the measures of success are very different for everyone.
Yeah.
But sustainability
100%.
is a whole nother thing that we don't talk about that often. So what are kind of the most important learnings for you about crafting a sustainable career as a director?
Yeah, there's so much stuff. Hey, I feel like, I mean, just looking back to in my early, or like post film school, being in my early 20s, you know, that's probably the hardest time when you're kind of finding your feet. You don't have the structure of film school anymore, and you have a lot of ambitions. It's like how to move forward. I feel like part of it is keeping your day job, but also finding one that like affords you flexibility. And that was really important, to not box yourself into, obviously everyone's circumstances are different, but you know, the year-long full-time job, that meant that it was all the more harder to take a week off to make a short film, you know. Just having those jobs that you can, that afford you flexibility, but also give you the ability to support yourself and separate the artist from the person who pays the rent. I think that's a really important thing, because if you put too much pressure on yourself to immediately make money from your passion, I think it's just way too much of an expectation, and just really bad for your mental health. You know, like there's a lot of ways to make stuff cheaply, but also I think that is really important, just to protect your passion for the work at all costs, because it is so easy to get downtrodden by perceived failures, and when it's tied up in the way that you make money as well, it's just so toxic. so yeah, there's a few things in there. Obviously not comparing yourself to others, which is a hard one not to do these days, but I think you just have to channel everything into like your work, and if you're looking outwards, it's hard to do that. So
and Karishma asks, how does it feel putting out a film on the other side of the world, showing at the London Film Festival while back in Australia in the middle of a pandemic, and have there been any unexpected benefits?
I get to be home, I guess, but I would much rather be over there for sure. What can I say? I mean, in Australia, at least, it's been great, because we originally were hoping for a theatrical run. And I think as a filmmaker, you always have a very romantic notion about your film being seen in a cinema as well. But we were released here on a streaming platform called Stan. And in the end, I feel like more people saw it, and everyone was home and safe. And so I couldn't have asked for more. Yeah, it was really nice.
It also plays in really well to watch Relic at home, because your home becomes really spooky after watching it.
Oh, right. Good. Good to know.
And Stephanie asks, I feel like Relic, as well as your early shorts, are interesting windows into the mundane, quiet horror of being a woman. You tackle ageism, reproductive rights, motherhood. Why do you think this is the best genre to convey or explore such themes?
Yeah, maybe because maybe I mentioned this before, about, you know, the ability to like visualize or externalize your fears. There's something about like defining them in such a way that I don't know, helps to convey the fear behind them. I don't know. I think also as well, I'm really interested in or drawn to surreal art forms, and horror can certainly is a way, certainly psychological horror allows you to play in that sandbox.
And I'd like to tack a question of my own onto that, and it's how do you feel, especially with your shorts and with Creswick in particular, which we keep referring to, having played at a lot of genre festivals, and Relic as well, having played at a lot of kind of big festivals, and obviously premiered at Sundance and now is at LFF, but also a lot of genre places. What do you How do you think the landscape for horror filmmaking has changed perhaps in the last couple of years?
Yeah, it definitely feels like maybe there's just more of a diversity in the voices telling the horror stories.
Mm,
If you think about horror and the way that it's been used traditionally in some films to, vilify minority groups, even whatever that is, whether that's people with mental health or mental illnesses or pregnant women or, people of color, then it's like the psychology is rooted in the otherness of
mhm,
anything that's outside of like the white male heteronormative experience. So it's kind of exciting now for people to be reclaiming those spaces, women and people of color, that kind of thing. So maybe that's one of the reasons why we're seeing such an amazing kind of surge of interesting horror
mm.
films. Yeah.
And was there something that you learned from the making of Relic, but also its release and its festival run around the world, that you think you'll take on to your future projects?
Yeah, I definitely learned a lot. There's a lot, but one thing I will say,
Mhm,
now that I'm writing a new script, I feel
mhm,
like if there's problems in your script, address them because some things that can be fudged in your script will just
mhm,
be amplified like in pre-production and doubly so in
mhm,
production. So yeah, I think I've gotten improved at kind of picking what those things are.
mhm.
And if something worries you in the script, it's a sure sign that you should look closer at it and not avoid it.
That is a very good learning. And I'm curious as well, kind of the film has been seen or is being released in or screened at festivals or whatnot around the world. What has been some of the more surprising receptions to the film that you've experienced
Mm.
in its run, as it's kind of coming up to the end of its run?
Yeah, surprising. I don't know. I have to say I've been really. I guess I've just been surprised because it has been largely quite positive, which is really lovely. I think you quickly lose perspective when you're making a film
Mhm,
about if it's any good. Is it, I don't know. You just when you're in the thick of it, you're watching it over and over and over again. So I really couldn't have told you at the start of its festival run how it
mhm.
was going to go at all. So that's been really lovely. But yeah, you definitely get some funny responses from people who hate it as well. That's been hilarious. Yeah, you get some hilarious, DMs like, I would rather get corona than watch your film again and stuff like
Who
that,
is this?
which I always find really, yeah. I can't remember the last time I like hated a film and then sought the director out to like tell them.
That is
Anyway,
a lot of effort.
yeah. So yeah, a real range, I would say.
And there's a question here from someone who doesn't share their name. So I see that your short film Drumwave, which is also excellent, is being developed into a feature too. Was it always the intention for both shorts to be proof of concepts for features, or did they begin as short films first and foremost? Also, I'll get to that after you answer the
Yeah,
first
yeah. Oh, okay, cool. Yes, yeah. So Creswick, as I said, was definitely one that was, we had the feature script and then we thought, let's
one.
make this proof of concept. And Drumwave similarly was always going to be a proof of concept for a bigger project.
Mm-hmm.
And we actually got it funded through a program that was specifically for, funding your proof of concept plus a first draft of the film. So yeah,
And
there's a pattern.
there's a second part to this question, and it's how has the development and production of these shorts and features overlapped?
For Drumwave, I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm.
Drumwave we shot in 2018. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the short was finished well before we started writing the feature, which in
Mm-hmm.
retrospect, I would recommend you do the other way around, because I feel like in some ways, I mean, it also, of course, depends on your timeline, but in some ways now that the feature has kind of changed and morphed as projects do, I feel like I could make a short that better kind of exemplifies what the feature is. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, just a little tip for anyone.
And we're very quickly running out of time. So if there's any burning questions from anyone, put them in the Q&A box now. But meanwhile, as we wrap up, I just wanted to ask you, what was the best piece of advice that you got when you were starting out in the industry?
Oh, I mean, probably something to the effect of like, make sure you're climbing the right ladder, or, you know, really chase what you want. Because when I was at film school, I used to assistant direct a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I think particularly, I think there was just a sense of, I thought I was being realistic going into this
Mm-hmm.
like really tricky industry by going, oh, okay, well, I'll just assist and direct, and then I can like segue into directing or something like that. And one of my lecturers basically told me, like, if you want to direct, you should just keep directing. That's the way to get there. Yeah, I guess I really took that to heart and made sure, you know, I certainly did PAing and assistant directing and all sorts of jobs, but I never did long form gigs. I just made
Mm-hmm.
sure they were really flexible, which meant that I could still keep directing. So, you know, I think there's certainly so many different ways to get into directing and to
Mm-hmm.
making your first feature, but it might take longer if you take too much of a detour.
And to wrap up, Stefan asks, what is your next project going to be?
Yeah, so the next project is Drumwave, which is like a
Mm-hmm.
Japanese folk horror, kind of taking the traditions of British folk horror, like The Wicker Man, but using Japanese mythology. So it's very much exploring fear of motherhood and yeah, I would say like Rosemary's Baby, of course, is a massive reference point. And yeah, very much about like creation and birth, uh, and the push and pull between like and selfhood and motherhood. So,
I mean, that sounds amazing. I cannot wait to see it.
thanks.
And maybe talk to you about it in when it's made in a year or a couple of
Yeah,
years.
absolutely.
Natalie, thank you so much for sharing so much about your process and
No
your
problem.
career so far. And thank you everyone for tuning in. And congratulations again on Relic. And I look forward to seeing Drumwave and everything else you do.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. It's been fun.